It was a typical Tuesday morning when I found the letter in my mailbox. The envelope was crisp, white, and bore the official logo of the Homeowners Association, HOA. I rolled my eyes, assuming it was just another mundane notice about lawn maintenance or trash pickup. But as I tore it open and skimmed the contents, my heart skipped a beat. In bold, capitalized letters, it read, "Violation Notice Offensive Vehicle Accessory." I blinked, confused. Offensive vehicle accessory? What the hell was that supposed to mean? I read on, my eyebrows knitting together in disbelief. Apparently, the sunshade on my truck's simple, reflective cover with a cartoonish pair of sunglasses printed on it was deemed offensive and a violation of the community's aesthetic standards. I laughed out loud. This had to be a joke. But as I flipped through the fine print, my laughter died in my throat. The letter outlined a law 4,000 fine for repeated violations, along with a threat of legal action if I didn't comply within 7 days. My stomach churned. For $1,000? For a sunshade? A sunshade that had been on my truck for over a year without a single complaint? What had changed? I didn't have to dig deep to figure it out. It was her. Linda, the self-appointed queen of our HOA. Linda was notorious for micromanaging every aspect of the neighborhood. If a flower pot was half an inch off center, Linda noticed. If a porch light was slightly brighter than the rest, Linda was on it. And now, it seemed, she had set her sights on me. My truck wasn't an eyesore. It was a well-maintained, clean, and legally parked vehicle. But Linda had a history of picking fights over completely arbitrary nonsense. And the worst part? She always managed to get away with it. She had a stranglehold on the HOA board, manipulating votes and twisting the bylaws to suit her personal vendettas. I wasn't the first to be targeted, but something told me Linda had a special kind of hatred reserved just for me. Maybe it was because I'd ignored her previous nitpicky demands, like the time she tried to ban driveway basketball hoops because they were too urban. Maybe it was because I didn't attend the HOA meetings where she basked in the attention of her own self-importance. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because I had dared to stand up to her before, and now she was making an example out of me. I slammed the letter down on my kitchen counter and took a deep breath, rage simmering in my chest. There was no way I was paying $4,000 for a sunshade. But ignoring Linda wasn't an option either. She had a history of escalating disputes to the point of legal harassment. She had sued a neighbor last year for parking a boat in their own driveway, citing an unapproved vehicle. She had reported another family to the city for having a front yard vegetable garden, claiming it violated the Sewell harmony of the street. She even forced a single mother to repaint her front door twice because the first 2 shades of blue weren't approved. This woman had too much power, and she thrived on using it to make people miserable. But this time, she had messed with the wrong guy. I wasn't about to roll over and let Linda extort me. If she wanted a fight, she was going to get one. And by the time I was done, she'd regret ever sending that letter. I knew Linda was power-hungry, but until I started digging, I didn't realize just how far her control extended. The HOA wasn't just an organization that set basic community guidelines, it was her personal kingdom, and she ruled it with an iron fist. There were no checks and balances, no reason, just a long-standing culture of fear and submission. I had lived in the neighborhood for years, but I had always ignored the HOA drama. That changed the moment I got hit with that ridiculous fine. I started asking around, trying to get a sense of how Linda operated, and the stories I heard made my blood boil. It turned out that Linda had a habit of making up rules on the fly and enforcing them selectively, mostly against people she personally disliked. A retired couple down the street told me that she had forced them to tear down their garden fence because it wasn't up to HOA standards, even though identical fences lined the entire street. Another neighbor whispered that Linda had tried to fine a teenager for washing his car in his own driveway, citing an outdated clause about unauthorized water usage. And then there was the absolute worst. A young couple who had moved in 6 months ago said Linda had shut down their home daycare, a fully licensed, state-approved operation because it supposedly brought undesirable foot traffic to the neighborhood. The couple had tried to fight back, but Linda had dragged them through an exhausting web of legal threats. And in the end, they gave up and moved out. The more I learned, the more I realized that this wasn't just about my sunshade. Linda thrived on control, and the HOA was her personal tool for keeping everyone in check. The fines? They weren't just for rule enforcement, they were for punishment. Linda was weaponizing the HOA bylaws to make sure the neighborhood bent to her will, and she had been doing it for years. But how was she getting away with it? The answer was simple. She had stacked the HOA board with her cronies. The HOA was technically supposed to be a democracy, with elected officials making fair decisions for the good of the community. But in reality, it was a rubber-stamped dictatorship. Linda controlled the vote counts, the agenda, and, most importantly, the money. At every HOA meeting, she made sure that her hand-picked board members outnumbered anyone who might dare to oppose her. Whenever an election rolled around, she would intimidate and pressure homeowners into voting for her allies. If anyone questioned her authority, she would drown them in endless paperwork, fines, and harassment. The entire HOA system had been rigged in her favor, and by the time people realized what was happening, they were already too exhausted to fight back. And then there was the money trail. I started looking into the HOA's financial records, and while I wasn't an accountant, even I could see that something wasn't adding up. The dues that homeowners were paying each year were absurdly high compared to similar neighborhoods in the area. The fines like my due law 4,000 Sunshade violation were adding up to tens of thousands of dollars in additional revenue. But where was all that money going? According to the official budget, the HOA was spending a ridiculous amount on administrative costs, a vague category that seemed to swallow up most of the funds. Meanwhile, the actual maintenance of the neighborhood was lacking. Sidewalk repairs were delayed, streetlights stayed broken for months, and the community pool, which was supposed to be funded by the HOA, had been closed for over a year. And yet, somehow, Linda had a brand new luxury SUV parked in her driveway. It was too much of a coincidence. Linda was clearly funneling money from the HOA into her own pockets, disguising it as administrative costs while bullying the rest of us into paying for it. And because she had complete control over the board, no one could challenge her without facing severe consequences. That was when I realized Linda wasn't just a petty dictator. She was a full-blown scam artist. And if I wanted to take her down, I had to be smart about it. This wasn't just about getting rid of my due law 4,000 fine anymore. This was about exposing Linda's corruption and ending her reign once and for all. I knew that simply complaining about Linda wouldn't get me anywhere. She had built an empire of fear around the HOA, and most people had given up fighting back. But I wasn't like most people. I wasn't just going to roll over and pay a bogus due law 4,000 fine. I was going to fight back the right way, and the best part? I was going to make sure she paid for it instead. My first step was understanding the HOA's own rules better than Linda did. If she wanted to play the game of twisting bylaws to her advantage, then I was going to beat her at it. I spent hours poring over the HOA bylaws, legal documents, and community covenants, every single word of fine print. At first, it was like reading another language, but the more I studied, the more I started to connect the dots. That's when I found it. Buried deep in the HOA's governing documents was a clause about unauthorized fines. It stated that any fine issued by the HOA must be explicitly supported by a written policy approved by a full community vote. In other words, Linda couldn't just make up rules on a whim. There had to be a recorded policy that was formally approved. And guess what? There was no official policy banning sunshades. Linda had completely fabricated the rule. That alone was grounds for dismissal of my fine, but I wasn't stopping there. I needed something bigger, something that would turn the tables completely. I kept digging, and that's when I stumbled upon another gold mine. The HOA bylaws included strict guidelines on financial transparency. Specifically, it required the HOA board to publicly disclose all collected fines and how the money was spent. But when I checked the last 3 years of financial reports, I noticed a pattern of missing records. Linda had been collecting fines, but there were no clear records of where the money had gone. This wasn't just incompetence, this was outright financial fraud. I wasn't the only one who noticed. As I started mentioning these inconsistencies to some of my neighbors, I saw the anger start to spread. Linda had been running this HOA like her personal piggy bank, and now I had the proof to bring her down. But I still needed a game plan. I drafted a formal dispute letter and sent it to the HOA board, citing the exact bylaw violations that made my fine illegitimate. I knew Linda would try to ignore it, so I made sure to send copies via certified mail, email, and hand-delivered one to Linda's mailbox. That way, She couldn't pretend she didn't receive it. Sure enough, she ignored my letter. But that played right into my hands. According to the HOA's own bylaws, any unanswered dispute must be resolved through mediation. That meant I had legal grounds to take the HOA to small claims court. And if I did that, Linda would have to explain her shady actions in front of a judge. But I wasn't stopping there. I filed a public records request to see if Linda had reported her income from HOA fines on her taxes. Homeowners associations are nonprofits, which means they are required to disclose their financial records. What I found made my jaw drop. Linda had been pocketing a significant portion of the collected fines without reporting them. That was tax fraud. At this point, I knew I had enough evidence to blow this wide open. But I needed to make sure it would stick, so I reached out to an HOA attorney not to hire, but for a consultation. I wanted to make sure my approach was airtight. The attorney took one look at my folder of evidence and laughed. "This is bad," he said. "For her, I mean. If you take this public, she's going to have a real problem." I asked him what my best course of action was. His advice: leverage the evidence to force an HOA vote to remove Linda from her position. If that didn't work, then I should go to the state HOA oversight board and report her for misuse of funds. I knew that Linda's power depended on fear. People were too afraid to stand up to her. But now that I had concrete evidence, I could finally turn the tide. I started talking to more neighbors, showing them the financial discrepancies and the bogus nature of my fine. Word spread fast. People started digging up their own violation letters, realizing that they had also been fined for bogus reasons. By the end of the week, I had a full-scale revolt brewing. People were furious not just about the fines, but about everything: the misused funds, the intimidation, the blatant abuse of power. It was time to make Linda pay. I organized a community meeting, inviting every homeowner to attend. The goal? A formal petition to remove Linda as HOA president. According to the HOA bylaws, if over 50 fan tram of the community signed, we could force a recall vote. I wasn't sure how many people would show up, but on the day of the meeting, nearly the entire neighborhood packed into the clubhouse. The room buzzed with anger. Linda arrived, looking smug until she saw the stack of signatures in my hands. That was the moment I knew I had her cornered. The next step? Forcing her to answer for everything she had done. And I wasn't going to stop until she was ruined. Linda's removal from office was just the beginning. With her power gone, the community immediately voted in a new HOA board, one that was actually fair and transparent. The ridiculous fines that Linda had imposed were refunded to every homeowner she had scammed. The embezzlement case was fully investigated, and Linda was eventually forced to pay back thousands of dollars in stolen funds. And the best part? The law $5,000 fine that Linda had been issued for ignoring her own violation. The new HOA board decided to use that money to throw a massive neighborhood barbecue, one where we all ate, laughed, and celebrated the end of Linda's reign. Linda? She didn't show her face again. She quietly sold her house, packed up her luxury SUV, and disappeared from the neighborhood forever. It was finally over. And as I sat back, enjoying a plate of barbecue ribs at the celebration paid for by Linda's own money, I couldn't help but smile. Justice had been served. Linda may have been the face of the tyranny, but she wasn't the only problem. She had spent years corrupting the HOA board, stuffing it with yes-men, and rigging the system to work in her favor. Sure, Linda was gone, but the infrastructure of her rule was still in place. If we didn't tear it down completely, it wouldn't be long before someone else took her place and started the cycle all over again. That wasn't going to happen. This wasn't just about removing Linda, it was about burning her entire legacy to the ground. We purged Linda's loyalists from the HOA board, exposing the full extent of her corruption. We reversed the damage she had done, fixing the neighborhood and eliminating her bogus rules. And we rewrote the HOA bylaws to ensure that no one could ever seize control like Linda had again. In the end, Linda's downfall brought the community together in a way nothing else ever could have. She had tried to build an empire of fear, but all she had done was give us the tools to make our neighborhood better than ever. And as I walked home, taking one last glance at the new community garden built on Linda's corruption, I couldn't help but smile. Because in the end, the best revenge wasn't just watching Linda lose everything. It was making sure her legacy was buried in the very ground she had once tried to control. And that That was the sweetest revenge of all. With Linda gone, the neighborhood felt like it could finally breathe again. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over us for years was lifted, and people began to reclaim their homes and their lives. The new HOA board, elected by a unanimous vote, was a breath of fresh air. They were transparent, fair, and actually listened to the concerns of the community. For the first time in years, it felt like we were in control of our own neighborhood. But even as we celebrated, I couldn't shake the feeling that Linda's shadow still loomed over us. She may have been forced out, but her legacy of fear and corruption wasn't entirely erased. There were still a few of her loyalists lingering in the background, and I knew that if we didn't root them out completely, it wouldn't be long before someone else tried to take her place. The new HOA board wasted no time in addressing the mess Linda had left behind. The first order of business was to audit the HOA's finances. It didn't take long for them to uncover the full extent of Linda's embezzlement. Overdue Law 90,000 had been siphoned from the HOA's funds, funneled into Linda's personal accounts through fake companies, and inflated administrative costs. The board immediately filed a formal complaint with the state's HOA Oversight Board, and a full investigation was launched. Linda was now facing not only the loss of her position, but also potential criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood, and the sense of relief was palpable. Linda's reign of terror was officially over. But the cleanup didn't stop there. The new board also took steps to reverse the damage Linda had done to the neighborhood. They eliminated all of her bogus fines and rules, including the ridiculous DO Law 4000 Sunshade violation that had started this whole mess. They also reduced the HOA dues back to reasonable levels, much to the relief of everyone in the community. The board then turned their attention to the physical state of the neighborhood. For years, Linda had ignored maintenance issues, letting sidewalks crack, streetlights stay broken, and common areas fall into disrepair. Now, with the budget no longer being funneled into Linda's pockets, the board had the funds to fix everything. They hired real maintenance crews, repaired the sidewalks, and even reopened the community pool, which had been closed for over a year. It was amazing to see how quickly the neighborhood transformed. People began to take pride in their homes again, and the sense of community that had been missing for so long started to return. One of the most satisfying parts of Linda's downfall was the Karen Memorial Project. The new HOA board decided to use the money Linda had stolen to create something positive for the neighborhood. After much discussion, they settled on building a community garden in the spot where Linda had illegally extended her driveway. The garden was a beautiful space, filled with flowers, fruit trees, and walking paths. It became a place where neighbors could gather, relax, and enjoy the outdoors. At the entrance to the garden, a sign was erected that read, "Dedicated to the neighborhood's future, funded by the HOA's past mistakes." It was a subtle nod to Linda's downfall, a reminder of how far we had come. The grand opening of the garden was a celebration unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. Dozens of neighbors gathered, laughing and talking as they explored the new space. There was food, music, and a sense of joy that had been missing for years. As I stood there, watching kids play and families take photos, I realized something. Linda had tried to control this neighborhood, but in the end, all she had done was bring us together. While the neighborhood was thriving, Linda's life was falling apart. The state investigation into her financial crimes was moving quickly, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. She was officially charged with embezzlement and fraud, and the new HOA board filed a lawsuit against her to recover the stolen funds. Linda tried to fight back, but it was no use. Her once loyal allies turned on her, cooperating with investigators and handing over every shady financial record they had. Her reputation was destroyed, and she was left with no one to turn to. In a final act of poetic justice, the court ordered Linda's remaining assets to be liquidated to pay back the money she had stolen. Her house, her luxury SUV, and even her fancy furniture were auctioned off. The neighborhood showed up to the auction, not to bid, but to watch as Linda's world crumbled in real time. Her beloved home, the place where she had sat on her high horse, lording over the community, was sold off to the lowest bidder. Her precious SUV, bought with our HOA fees, was auctioned off to some random guy who planned to repaint it bright pink just for fun. Linda was forced to stand there, watching as everything she had stolen was stripped away, piece by piece. For the first time in her life, she was completely powerless. After the auction, Linda had no choice but to leave town. She was broke, humiliated, and facing serious legal trouble. As she loaded up her last few belongings into a beat-up old car, she tried to slink away quietly. But the neighborhood had other plans. The moment she stepped outside, she was greeted by dozens of homeowners standing in their yards, watching her leave. No one said a word. No one waved. Just cold, satisfied silence as she drove away for the last time. And then, the celebration began. People laughed, cried, and literally danced in the streets. Linda had finally gotten what she deserved, and the best part? She couldn't blame anyone but herself. With Linda gone, the neighborhood felt brand new. People who had once been afraid to step out of line were now relaxing, decorating their homes however they wanted, and actually enjoying their neighborhood. The ridiculous HOA fines were a thing of the past, and the new HOA board was fair and transparent, making sure everyone was treated with respect. Every time we walked past Linda's old house now owned by a young couple who had turned it into a welcoming home, we all shared the same thought. We won. Linda had tried to control everything, but in the end, she lost everything. And the neighborhood? We were stronger than ever. Justice had been served, and Linda was nothing but a bad memory. In the end, Linda's downfall brought the community together in a way nothing else ever could have. She had tried to build an empire of fear, but all she had done was give us the tools to make our neighborhood better than ever. The Karen Memorial Project became a symbol of our resilience and our ability to overcome even the most oppressive forces. It was a reminder that no matter how much power someone like Linda had, they could never truly control us. As I stood in the garden, surrounded by laughing neighbors and the smell of barbecue filling the air, I realized something. Linda's legacy wasn't one of fear and control. It was one of unity and strength. Her downfall had brought us together, and in the end, that was the sweetest revenge of all. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.